Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to be with you again this morning. This session, about which I will tell you much more in the next few minutes, has been a tradition during our Board of Governors meeting. It is sponsored by the FRENKEL-ZUCKERMAN Institute for Global Economics within the context of the Board of Governors. This is already our 10th edition, and we are very fortunate to have with us the trustees, or the key trustees of this institute. Up to yesterday, there were Mr. X and Mr. Y. After last night, they are already Dr. X and Dr. Y. And let me, as a formal matter, invite Dr. Jamie James Gertler to open these proceedings. As you know, and it was described in detail last night, he is, in addition of being an honorary doctor of Tel Aviv University, he is a governor of our great university. He is a trustee of the Zuckerman Foundation and a member of the board of directors of the FRENKEL-ZUCKERMAN Institute. So, Jamie, if I may ask you to come over, take the mic for literally a few seconds. You know, an hour has quite a few seconds too. So the floor is yours.
Good morning. Boker Tov. I'm honored to be here as the FRENKEL-ZUCKERMAN Institute hosts these outstanding leaders in global economics and geopolitics. Since the founding of the FRENKEL-ZUCKERMAN Institute has become an international hub for research on developing sound economic policies, offering unique insights on innovation and growth. It is truly an honor to introduce Professor Jacob Frenkel, chairman of the Institute and a dear personal friend, who has been shepherding the Institute and its mission from day one. As it's become a tradition, which Jacob had just said, during these Board of Governors meetings, Professor Frenkel will be chairing and moderating this session. But before I hand the mic over to Jacob, I would be remiss if I did not say a few words about my fellow Canadian, Mark Carney. Mark was born in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. That's really north. The average temperature in Fort Smith in January is a balmy minus 18 degrees Celsius. Mark wasn't born in the middle of nowhere. He was born in the outskirts of nowhere. At 6, he moved way south to Edmonton, Alberta, still pretty north, and like my daughter Julia, is a big Edmonton Oilers fan. As importantly, Mark then played hockey for the Harvard Crimson on 3 teams that made it to the NCAA Final Four, and then he proved, in fact, that there is in fact a career after Crimson hockey. I'm sure Jacob will tell the audience some of your other better-known accomplishments. Thank you. Jacob?
Thank you very much, Jamie. As you can see, we have on the stage and in the hall numerous number of governors. Some governors of the most important institutions like Tel Aviv University, some governors of some central banks, all former governors, which means two things. Being a former governor, this is the only title nobody can take away from you. And second, they don't have the excuse of hiding behind their tight-lipped responsibilities because they are now free agents. And we will get from them a lot of insights. The theme of the discussion today are crises. Crisis can be the theme for discussion from now to eternity, because there will always be a new crisis of one form or another. But the real issue is, as Winston Churchill said in the mid-40s, we should not let this crisis be wasted. Rahm Emanuel in the US plagiarized that remark, but it is really Winston Churchill, and it all came in Yalta, when Sir Winston met with Roosevelt and Stalin, and this trio, in a completely unrealistic, surrealistic approach, decided to join hands and in a way lay the foundations to what would be, after the war, the Reconstruction, the UN, you name it. The world has changed since. The important issue is, how do we learn from crisis? Each individual here on the stage has had to navigate crisis, draw lessons from it. Some will say maybe they have produced crisis, who knows? We will hear all of that. But let me start by introducing them because, and very, very briefly. We are privileged to have with us the former governor of the Bank of Israel, Professor Carney. Carney has been governor between 2013 and 2018. She has had a distinguished career, graduate of the Hebrew University. I don't hold it against her. We rectified it by bestowing on her an honorary degree of Tel Aviv University some time ago, a PhD from Columbia University, international experience with the International Monetary Fund, with the Inter-American Development Bank, leading the research work of the Bank of Israel for many, many years, subsequently becoming deputy governor of the central bank and culminating with the great position of governor of the central bank. As you may know, there are various rankings among governors, and the famous Global Finance magazine has ranked her among the top governors of the world, giving her the grade of A. They don't have A+, by the way. We worked together a lot over quite a few years, and one of the crises that we will come back towards the end of our deliberations has been the fallouts and lessons from the Ukraine situation. And about 30 years ago, in a different context, Carney has led the work of the Bank of Israel to define and characterize the optimal way and challenges associated with the absorption of huge number of immigrants into the economy. And I think that some of the lessons will be relevant also today. She's now a professor at the Hebrew University, vice president for research in the Israel Democracy Institute. We are privileged, and we already were introduced this morning to Jean-Claude Trichet, a very dear friend, long-standing friend. In fact, more than 35 years we have been in the trenches. Jean-Claude has led the international efforts of practically every economic initiative that has taken place in the last 40 years. He has been the director de Trésor in the Banque de France. He has been the head of the Paris Club, the place where one deals with debt of very poor countries. He has been governor of the Banque de France, during the 90s. He has been the president of the European Central Bank, the ECB, during the first decade of this century. He was very close and working with Mitterrand and Chirac at the time. He is now with various think tanks. We are colleagues at the G30, which he led in extraordinary success. Of course, does not come out of thin air, graduate of the University of Paris and graduate of the most important programs in political science and state administration in France. The Eurozone crisis gives us a huge insight into his character, and I will ask Jean-Claude as we move on to tell us a little bit more about these activities. Everyone calls him our honorary boss, whether it is the Trilateral Commission, whether it is the G30, whether it is the Banque de France. So we are really very honored to have you here with us. Mark Carney proves that geography does not matter. When there is a great man with great ideas, or great woman for that purpose, equilibrium will find him and designate him to do the right thing. So Mark started his career at the Canadian Treasury, of course, graduating from Harvard, getting his PhD from Oxford, the right combination of what makes a successful professional these days. But at the Bank of Canada and at the Bank of England, he had to deal with very important crises. The crisis that had to do with the global financial crisis that Jean-Claude and him worked together on, and then, of course, navigating the United Kingdom during Brexit. It is the irony of history. The man who gave the advice and warned us about the dangers and the cost of doing the Brexit found himself having to navigate the economy once the decision has been made. I should say that, as you can see him, he's very modest, but he was elected or chosen to be the most trusted Canadian. Believe it or not, excuse me, the Canadians, he is the one who was chosen. He is now having a baby, a brainchild, how to use economics properly to deal. You did not know about it. How to deal with the major issue of climate change. And indeed, he changed the public debate about climate change from dogma or science per se into very practical implications. All activities require eventually to be financed and to be analyzed through a logic of the economics, and he basically laid the foundation and rules about how to do that. We will hear about him. The reason why he is so successful is that not only he was the goalie of the ice hockey when he was in college, he is also a very important runner. He is, I don't know how many of you are running marathons, but 3 hours, 31 minutes and 22 seconds is a real record of any governor of central bank. And he did it. In fact, he proved that to be the governor of the Bank of England improves your pace relatively to the governor of Canada, because he broke his own record by 15 minutes, the one from Ottawa versus London. Okay, I think this is enough, and we will go now to the question of crisis. World has changed. The world has changed dramatically. We are even in this room for in-person discussion. It was mentioned time and again. But it is the time now to draw lessons. And why don't I ask each one of you in order? We will ask for, I will let you actually decide who do you want to do first. They produced crisis. You absorbed crisis. So maybe before you are telling us how you absorb them, Jean-Claude, tell us a little bit anecdotes with insights like you always know about crisis. Go.
I know the anecdote you have in mind, Jacob. If you wish, I can mention not a crisis, but the difficulty of setting up the euro. And the anecdote is the following. I will not say that I experienced it myself, but a French professor, very, very, I would say, important, was invited in the US in a university to deliver some speech on the euro in the making. So he had prepared very well with slides the exposition, went in the meeting, and was a little bit surprised because at 8:30 he was supposed to start. And there was absolutely nobody in the room. So he waited, having prepared everything, he wanted to speak. So after, I would say, 30 minutes, somebody came in. So he considered he had the audience. So he started, after all, he had traveled. He projected the slides, made a very beautiful speech of 3/4 of an hour. And he had, as you might imagine, some meager applauses. And then he was packing everything, and he was leaving the room. And then the man in the room, or the person in the room, I'm sorry, because I remember it was a lady, and she said, please, sir, don't leave the room. I am the next speaker. So it's...
So I can tell you, Jean-Claude, at the same conference, a few years later, the room was packed. No, there was standing room only. The euro was created, and one of the reasons why the empty room became a packed room is your work on the euro. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the challenges that you had.
Yeah, thank you so much. But first of all, I will echo what you said, Jacob. I lived myself in permanent crisis. The emerging debt crisis, which was totally dramatic, starting at the beginning of the 80s, the crisis in I would say, the dot-com bubble explosion, the crisis of Lehman Brothers, and I would say the subprime crisis, because for me, the first very, very grave crisis was that our own money market was totally collapsing on August 9, 2007, before Lehman Brothers, and we had to intervene. And of course, it is very telling in terms of lessons to be drawn, because we had to take a decision in the governing body of the ECB during, I would say, 3 hours. 3 hours, we decided to supply liquidity without any limit to the European economy, the euro area economy, and we were asked 95 billion euros on the 9th of August 2007. And it was, for me, the start of something which was big, new, and culminated, of course, with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. So we had the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, new set of very bold decisions to be taken on both sides of the Atlantic, in London, everywhere, in the advanced economy, because it was really a crisis of the advanced economy, in minutes, in order to cope with the situation and prove that there were a crew, a pilot and several pilots, if I may, in the plane. It was very, very important at the time. And we generalized, as far as the ECB was concerned, the unlimited supply of liquidity. And then we had the euro crisis, so-called, the sovereign debt crisis in the euro area, which again called for extremely rapid and quick and expeditious decisions in May 2010, when we decided to intervene, targeting Greek treasuries, Irish treasuries, and Portuguese treasuries. And it was, of course, a very, very grave, very dramatic event when it was clear that the speculation in the market was devastating on these three countries. And then in 11, we had to intervene massively on Spain and on Italy. So very quick, expeditious decisions taken in times where the textbook were not giving you any particular recommendation. You had to invent, and you had to invent rapidly on the basis of all the information you could get. And one also of the lessons of the crisis was not being quick, being expeditious, but also take absolutely all information available, not only the modeling, excellent modeling that we had, which proved inadequate, of course, when crisis was unfolding extraordinarily rapidly and dramatically. Take all, and in particular, and then we are back in Tel Aviv University with close links with entrepreneurs and the real economy. And the real economy information which was coming to us was much more important than the model that we had. And it's not surprising, doesn't mean the model were wrong, means in times of crisis, what is unfolding is very difficult to predict, very difficult to understand from inside by appropriate mathematical or economic modeling. So I would say lessons, because you ask us to be very concise, lessons to be drawn. Be prepared for everything. Anything can happen. The Knightian, I would say, uncertainty is really the right concept. Be prepared for everything. So be resilient as possible, whatever could happen. And so the scenario analysis, the test case analysis is very important. Second, be very quick and expeditious in your decision. And third, I would say, it's also very important, beware of fashion. We were in a fashion which was that great moderation had solved all problems. It proved a dramatic fashion. Only a few months ago, the fashion was interest rates are eternally low, real interest rate and nominal interest rate eternally low, inflation is out of scope, totally. And don't be, I would say, too pessimistic. You are in the best of the world possible. And now we know it's untrue, exactly as it was untrue to take to the letter the great moderation rhetoric. I stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will return in the second round to issues of monetary policy, and we will speak therefore on interest rates, of course, and inflation. But you are raising the important point of, first, prepare yourself for the unknown. It's a challenge, how does one do it? Resilient, we need to define it, of course. Humility, we do not know everything, and we should not pretend that we know everything. And this will bring me now to our second speaker. Please, Mark Carney.
It's funny, when you said humility, I thought, well, he's not talking about me, so it must be someone else. Sorry. Okay, let me try and make a few points on crisis preparation, and I very much learned from my fellow panelists in this regard, and I'm going to finish with an anecdote, if I may. The first is to pick up what you and Jean-Claude just said. The way I think about it is, you said humility, I think of plan for failure. Think about what can go wrong. I think it was Eisenhower who said that plans are useless in the end, but planning is essential. That process of developing the muscle memory of what would we do if, and you know, we're always doing scenarios as central bankers of there could be problems in the money market funds, there could be this, there could be that. What actually hits you is different. It becomes a Brexit, it becomes COVID, it becomes something like that. But plan for failure, first thing. The second is, and Jean-Claude, we live this very much, is once the crisis hits, and these are the words of Tim Geithner, plan beats no plan. So your original plan may not have been relevant, but you have to come up with a plan. And the best is the enemy of the good. And you need to coalesce your team around the plan and have a communication with the public that you have a plan, because you're in a position of panic. The next I would say is, I mean, there's an obvious point. Because of uncertainty, you can't spin your way out of crisis. So So you have to admit what the problems are, and when you get new information, you have to acknowledge that and change. And if the path you were on was different than the one you should go with the new information, admit it. People can handle those adjustments if you're upfront. If you try to smooth it over, then that's when you become lost. And I'll get to my last point, which is, and then my anecdote. In the end, in a financial crisis, you need overwhelming force, and overwhelming force can only come from the state or the center, which is the central bank. As Ben Bernanke would say, look, there are no atheists in foxholes, and there are no libertarians in a financial crisis. In the end, it comes from the center. Now, here's my anecdote. I became governor of the Bank of Canada February 1st, 2008. And about 2 weeks later, we had the first meeting of what was then called the G10 Central Bank Governors. It doesn't exist anymore, chaired by Jean-Claude. And it's in Basel, and we would have a dinner of just the governors, and it's the one time you could be absolutely open and frank, admit what you didn't know, and come to conclusions. So I roll into this dinner, my first one. Bear Stearns, I don't know if you remember, this was the early version of Lehman. Bear Stearns, fifth largest investment bank, is melting down into the weekend. At that point, unprecedented. We get to the dinner, we sit down, and I'm all prepared. I've got all my notes and numbers and things, thinking we're going to do things. Jean-Claude starts the dinner, and he says, "Mark, I want to welcome you. You're in the G10 Central Bank Governors. We're in Basel. Basel has the best wine cellar in Europe. And since it has the best wine cellar in Europe, it has the best wine cellar in all the world." And then he proceeds to go through the wines, and he makes recommendations. I'm from the north of Canada. What do I know? It's like wine, red, white, two things. And he proceeds and says, this have the Burgundy with the foie gras, but maybe you might want to, etc. And this takes about 10 minutes. And then he says, "Okay, listen, we've got about 50 minutes until Tokyo opens, until Asia opens. We have, the governments aren't doing anything. We have to come up with a facility or all is lost. Ben, what should we do?" And they go around, and at the end of the 50 minutes, there is at that point an unprecedented, it sounds like nothing now, 50 billion or so liquidity facility has come. So what do I take from that experience? And it worked. It actually worked in terms of bridging it. There were more to come, obviously. I take from that experience, what was the point? It was to make me part of the team. You're a part of a team. It's part of a special. It's to show deliberation. And then it's to have a plan. The central banks have a plan. And at the time to have that overwhelming force and have a plan that at a then unprecedented level. So those are my quick observations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And a theme that will come again and again, that at the end of the day, it's leadership in every content, in every instant. In that particular thing, it was Jean-Claude's leadership. And you can only do the counterfactual. What would have been the state of affairs if this person or that person was not around the table? So this means that we are really fortunate again. You spoke about plan for failure. There is the saying, those who try may fail. Those who do not try have failed. So the point is, yes, one needs to try, which means prepare for failure, but it should not deter you from starting. And I took one more important point, which is you can't spin yourself out of a crisis. And why can't you? Because you have to look into the future. Credibility. At the end of the day, you must have a long-term perspective. And that's what is common to the people around this table. And I think that unless you have a long-term perspective, you couldn't care less if credibility is gone. But if you have any long-term perspective, which is essential for investment and growth, you can't spin yourself out of a crisis. We spoke now about the international big guys who produce the environment that we all, the smaller countries also, are part of, but namely typically on the receiving side. And Carney is with us, coming from a great country, but a very small one. On the receiving side, Now that you heard all of those guys telling you what they did, how did you handle it? Shoot.
So Israel is not only a small and open economy, but it's also situated in a tough neighborhood. So I think over the 74 years of existence, we had to learn how to deal with shocks, both coming from the global economy, but also home-produced. And I think that actually, if I look at the first 50 years, it was mostly locally produced shocks, meaning mostly security, wars, conflicts, and also we had to deal with large waves of immigration. When I look at the last 20 years, it's mostly external shocks that we had to deal with. But the experience of dealing with shocks actually, I think, meant that Israel had to build up its resilience. And you mentioned resilience, but resilience in many, many aspects. One aspect is macroeconomic resilience, financial sector resilience, fiscal resilience, which means that you always have to have fiscal space to respond to shocks, and crisis preparedness in the sense that actually in all ministries and in the Bank of Israel, we also prepare, we work with scenarios and we have exercises how to deal with various crises. You never know which crisis and what shape and kind of crisis will come, as you said, but I think the process of how to make quick decisions, knowing that you don't have all the information, you have to deal with the information that you have now. I think this kind of preparedness and building up resilience in the system made Israel able to deal with the large shocks that came about recently. And when I think about the last major shocks, the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis, in both cases actually this preparedness and policy space allowed us to deal with it relatively successfully. Israel had a relatively mild effect of these two crises, I think because it has been sort of accustomed to dealing with and practiced dealing with a lot of crises in the past. So I think this is the main lesson for Israel. The last thing I just want to stress, many times in our monetary decisions, someone would say, let's wait another month and we'll have more information about A, B, and C. And I think one of the lessons in that area is that maybe you will have information about A, B, and C, but there will be other uncertainties. So you have to take decisions now on the basis of what you know now.
Thank you very much, because you actually paved the way for our next topic, which is, should we wait, shouldn't we wait, until when do we wait, and all the rest. You know, you are now spending your time in London, Mark, and I remember many years ago, somebody explained to me that crises are like London buses. You stand in the station and wait, and wait, and wait, and the buses do not come. And then suddenly 4 buses come together. You can call it Swan or you can call it whatever it is. But then when you go on them, they don't go to where you wanted them to go. So how lucky you are, you don't need to use so much the buses. But we need to learn the lessons. You remember there is this guy who was condemned to die on his way to the electric chair. He was overheard mumbling to himself, "This will teach me a lesson." So the real issue is to ensure that we learn the lessons on time. We may overshoot, but that's life, because the alternative to overshoot is undershoot. You will never hit it exactly at the point. And today, we are engaged in discussions with if you remove the word former, so all the governors are engaged with the question, are we behind the curve? What is the curve? How do we handle these kind of things? And does it come with the territory? So there is a strategic question. I'm not going to discuss who should do what and when. That's beyond the scope of this discussion. But if there are lessons from what has happened in the past X years, two things. First, the time in which you act. Maybe we can have reflections on this. And second, what is the domain over which? In the old days, central banking were very well-defined discipline. The objectives were clear, the tools were clear, the yardstick was clear. But in the past period, many for good reasons at the time, the mandate overexpanded itself because some governments went to sleep and central banks had to rise to the challenge, and many things like this have happened. 20 years ago, we would not have mentioned questions like climate when you talk about central banking, financial stability. So I want to turn now to a brief discussion on the scope and strategies of central banking. And I can let anyone go first, whatever you want. I will go now by the order because Jean-Claude, you have done many things in your life. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jacob. First of all, you should speak more as moderator because all what you say is full of wisdom. And I think that we can call you the master of all of us. You were my predecessor in the G30, and all your speeches were extraordinarily eloquent and wise, even in very difficult time, I have to say. Now, I would only say that our successors, my successors, had to cope with something which, fortunately, I didn't know myself, namely the threat of materialization of the deflationary risk. And that, of course, was new. So they had to cope with that, and they had to take decisions that were wise because of this immediate, grave and immediate threat of deflation. Now, that being said, it seems to me that it was largely because, and you said that, they were more or less the only game in town. Had they had more support by parliaments, governments, social partners, they might be a little bit less under stress. And I think that there is a lesson to be drawn from this period of 10 years, where they were really the only game in town, with a lot of very difficult decisions to take, it is that they might have been more demanding on the other partners. That is something which I mentioned en passant. That being said, and I conclude on that, the lessons we drew pragmatically from the Lehman, I would say, drama, was pragmatically, without any, I would say, elaboration in the Basel charming dinners that you mentioned, Mark, we decided together independently that we would all be much more communicating people and entities than we were before. There was the generalization of the press conferences, which did not existed as a general rule before. We decided that we would be much keener on monitoring banking surveillance and financial surveillance in general, that we should not forget that systemic risk was also part of our franchise, even if it was not our main goal. And I could elaborate more on that, in particular on the fact that we agreed upon the single definition of price stability, 2%. And the big central banks that are issuing the currencies that are in the basket of the special drawing rights all decided independently, progressively, that they would all say 2% is an appropriate definition of price stability. In Japan, in the US, it was not the case, neither in Japan nor in the US before the crisis. And of course, in the UK and in Europe. So today, it seems to me that we have something which is as important as the explosion of Bretton Woods. We have an arithmetic anchoring of the international monetary system. I stop there.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. Indeed, in your term, this was, as president of European Central Bank, a lot of precedents were created and very dramatic, raising the profile and stature of central banking. I remember when the farewell event for you, when you stepped down from the European Central Bank, and that's where Angela Merkel gave all the praise. So in other words, this is a situation where we would not have had it just a few years earlier. I want to turn now back to Mark Carney. An important part of your legacy was the creation of the Financial Stability Board, which you chaired, and you introduced into the menu of objectives for central banks to secure not only price stability, but also financial stability, which really changed dramatically the way we look at the situation. And why don't I give you now the floor, and you can also discuss if you want curves and behind or not behind, but you can now take the floor.
Okay, thank you. Well, yes, I guess I go back to first principles, which we all live, which is what is the ultimate responsibility of central banks? And it is, to put it in lay people's terms, it's confidence in money, aspects of money. Now, in different countries, the range of responsibilities around that vary. The Bank of England has the most expansive version of this, in part because it had the most arguably the most difficult financial crisis, I would say, of the major economies. So yes, you worry about banknotes, you worry about payment systems, you worry about monetary stability, price stability. That's confidence in money. My money's not going to be eroded. But you also worry, as Jean-Claude just said, about financial stability. Are the banks going to fall apart? You know, that's a direct responsibility of the Bank of England. And are there the big systemic risks that exist? Now, monetary policy, as you know, but to be clear, is not the instrument to address all those risks. It's for price stability. In the absolute extreme, though, the financial stability risks start to affect price stability risks, because if your financial system falls apart, if people lose confidence in money, you enter into a horrible economic situation. Deflationary spiral as a possibility. And unfortunately, we had a few situations over the course after the financial crisis, or during the financial crisis, where we were on the cusp of that. Much worse than that Basel dinner. The Basel dinner was, actually the wine was pretty good, even I could tell. I'll make 2 points here. One, a quick thing just to give a sense. And again, Jean-Claude, you were directly involved in this, which is after Lehman failed, we could see, because of contacts with the real economy, not in the models, not in the financial market data, that the economy was in free fall. And we could also sense that the financial institutions, the contagion was coming. So with yourself, Levine, Ben, Mervyn, myself, we did a coordinated interest rate cut, 50 basis points, in order to get through to the weekend, so that the authorities, the governments could take their responsibilities. It was the right thing to do because we knew where the economy was going, but it also bridged. Now, I had to, in Canada, we were having an election at the time, and the then Prime Minister had started the election on a campaign that was basically everything's fine. And you know, it's a short campaign, so it was hard for them to change. They had a better slogan than that, but that was basically the slogan. And you know, everything was falling apart around, but they didn't want to change. And I sat there and thought, okay, well, an emergency interest rate cut suggests that everything isn't quite fine. And so politically, this is a bad thing to do. But then I thought, but wait a minute, if I'm not doing it because I'm worried about the politics, then I'm being political, because it is the right thing to do. So we did it together. I called the finance minister at 11 o'clock at night and told him this was coming out at 7 in the morning. He said, "Can I tell the prime minister?" I said, "Well, at about 6:45. He agreed with that assessment because Ottawa's a small place, and if there was any more time, he could have come over. Anyways, to show how good politicians central bankers are, we do the cut, the government poll ratings go up, and they win, tons of seats in the election because somebody was doing something. Anyways, that's the point. You have to do the right thing. I probably should stop there because I want to hear what Carney has to say. And if you want to talk about the current situation, well, I'll leave it to you to decide.
Very good. Yes, you mentioned that one of the objectives is confidence in money. And I can tell you a little anecdote. One day when I was governor, the head of one of the religious parties came to my office at the Bank of Israel telling me that there is a solution to inflation. We should do what the US does. If somebody saw once a US dollar bill, it says, "In God we trust." I joked and said, yes, in God we trust, everyone else pays cash. But we had a real debate whether we should put on the Israeli shekel, "In God we trust," and you had the same, well, different guy.
Same member, but also
Yes. But I want to tell you also another little anecdote, which I'm not sure I told it before, which has to do with elections. Is Habash here? Yeah, okay. There was a short period after the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin and before the elections of Netanyahu that Shimon Peres was the Prime Minister. And inflation at the time was high, and we in the Bank of Israel had the usual discussion every period, a regular basis, what should be the next step. It was clear to us, to those around the table, that in the abstract, it was clear to us that in the abstract, given the circumstances, we should raise interest rates. It was obvious, no question. And then we had a little bit of a theoretical discussion, which you just told us. There is going to be elections in a week or two, probably shorter even. And if we do what we need to do, it will be viewed as intervening with the election. If we decide not to, and things go ex post, it will be clearly we have intervened in the election. So what do we do? And I'll tell you, we were very, very tight-lipped. We never spoke to anyone. The Minister of Finance never knew what is going to be the decision. Only the Prime Minister, we had a special relations with Rabin that knew that there might be something, but we had an agreement, nobody says anything to anyone, etc. But here we have a problem. Car bombs, bus bombs in the streets, elections next week, inflation is coming, and here poor Bank of Israel needs to make a decision. So I decided to, after talking to my colleagues, to confide in one person. And I went to Professor Chaim Ben Shachar, who was my mentor. And I shared it with him. And he told me, there is only one thing you should do. Go to Shimon Peres, he is the Prime Minister, put it on the table and be as frank as you can and tell him what you are going to do. Not ask him, but tell him. So I went to his home, and his wife, Sonia, gave me a lot of fruits, and I'm telling him, listen, Mr. Prime Minister, we called him Shimon, this is the situation, those are the charts. If there was no election, I would not have come to you. There is election, I want you to know we are not going to play politics, and this is what we are going to do, but I want to know your reflections. And he said, well, I can tell you one thing. If you need to raise interest rates and you don't, then you will default on your responsibility. I don't know what you're going to do. So do just what you need to do, and please don't put the elections on the table. And we went down, and the next day we raised rates. He lost the election, but not because of the interest rate. There was another, seriously, there was another bus bomb, which is another sad story, and I'll tell you about it at another occasion. So this is where we are. Carney, you had enough time to reflect about how do you think about what you just heard, please.
So you were talking before about the overburdening of the central bank, and I think in the case of Israel, the law is actually in a way overburdening the central bank in two ways. One is that the governor is also the economic advisor to the government. And the other is that among the targets or the goals of the policy is reducing social gaps. By the way, that was the law that was adopted in 2010. So I think regarding the first burden, actually the governor has been the advisor to the an economic advisor to the government since the beginning of the central bank in '54. And it actually led to the creation of a very strong research department and to the creation of infrastructure, of knowledge about the Israeli economy. And I think that it generally has served the country well, although not necessarily it served the governors well. It did create quite a lot of conflicts over the years. I know you had your share, I had my share of conflicts with the government. But I think that, well, if you design institutions from scratch, you would probably not put the advisory body to the government within the central bank. But having that since '54 and having the knowledge, the infrastructure, the human capital, I think it's right to leave it there in spite of this inelegant structure of institutions. Regarding the burdening with reducing social gaps as one of the goals of the central bank, well, as you all know, central banks don't have the tools to reduce social gaps, although its monetary policy have some effect on the income distribution and wealth distribution. It doesn't have a direct tool to deal with that. But having the role of an advisor to the government, actually, the way I interpreted this goal of the central bank is that I can advise the government on how to reduce social gaps. So in a way, this sort of ties together. Maybe one comment on monetary policy as it has evolved since the global financial crisis. We talked about the zero lower bound and the fact that central banks generally had to be quite creative in creating new policy tools because interest rate was already at zero and we wanted to expand the stimulus or expand monetary policy even though interest rate was at zero. And that actually, one of the tools that were sort of developed since the global financial crisis has been the forward guidance. Basically, central banks are sort of telling what they plan to do with the intention to affect the market rates, the yields over the shorter run. I think one of the experience that when I'm looking at the effect of this tool over the years has been the problem of time inconsistency. We want to affect yields now, so we say that we plan to leave interest rate low for very long, but then when the time comes, maybe there is a need to actually raise interest rate before we intended to, and then we were trapped in the commitment we made. So I think that the price of this sort of new tool has sort of become clearer over time, and that's just a comment on monetary policy.
Thank you. So you are back into the long-term perspective, and therefore we need to be aware of it. You were also modest to mention that you were the one running the Bank of Israel Research Department that really produced all the goodies that you were mentioning there. You also mentioned the independence of central banking decisions, and that's a very important one. You know, there was the story about the built-in stress between central banks and governments, and in fact, when I met both Mark Carney first and Jean-Claude Trichet first, they were actually in their respective treasuries. They were not born governors. They only elevated themselves eventually to this level. But the story goes that a guy decided to go and meet his high school friend who has now become governor, very important governor. And he went to his office, and Knox comes in and sit down. They start chatting, and then the phone rings. And the governor picks up the phone and says, no, no, no. Yes, no, no, no. So the guy who came to visit him, he says, who was he? He says, well, this was the Minister of Finance. So what did you say yes on? He said, well, he asked me if I hear him. So we will go in a minute to the sanctions, Ukraine, migration, but still one word about, if any one of you want to say something about, only if you want, behind the curve, or is it tough, is it not tough? If you feel constrained, it's okay also, please.
I'll just say one quick word in terms of the context, which we've been talking about a period which is largely one post-financial crisis up until COVID, which more or less was a period of deficient demand. Inflation below target, we're trying to provide stimulus, only game in town, trying to move things up. What happens with COVID, in part because of COVID, but also because of other factors, is, and I'm sure we'll get into this, a series of supply shocks that are hitting the economies. The world goes from integration to fragmentation as a direction. We have Brexit in the UK, which is a supply shock first and foremost, and I'm sorry, I told you so. I told them that this was going to happen, exactly what's happening. I got a lot of grief for that, but anyways, we have this supply adjustment, and what it does, it creates inflationary pressures. If you only have one supply shock, just the price of oil, let's say, you can probably look through it in general, but when you have a series, you have to make tough decisions, and in part, because there's a series of these supply shocks, the inflation coming with it, coming out of this deficient demand position, central banks admittedly are behind the curve. I think they're all using not quite that specific language, but it should be recognized that they are in a very different position than was the case that reigned from 2008.
Thank you very much. Jean-Claude wants to pitch in?
Just one word too. Mark mentioned earlier the fact that central banks were able to take decisions which were much more forthcoming, much more accommodating in crisis time than what the government would have imagined. And we have also not only your example, Mark, which was very telling, in the US, when the Fed embarked on fighting against Lehman Brothers, the Congress was not on board. And when the Treasury decided to accompany the central bank with $1 trillion move, the Congress said no. So independence, if I may, of central banks works in both directions. We can resist pressure of governments when they are not warranted, and we can be ahead of the curve in time of crisis, and we proved it. So I mentioned that en passant because it's not very well known, but Mark made the point.
So, Jean-Claude, I will now reveal a little bit something. I'm not sure I told you about it. Many years ago, the President of the Republic, Mr. Chirac, came to visit Israel. And I was in the receiving line, and President Weizmann, who was at the time the President of the State of Israel, went and he introduced us. And when he stopped next to me, President Weizmann told to Chirac, this is our central bank governor. And Chirac says, is he giving you the same trouble that my governor gives us? And Weizmann said, more than that, and he's doing therefore the right thing. So Chirac said, yes, I agree, we are happy to have Jean-Claude Trichet. That's what he said. There was no journalist. I think I want to shift quickly to the last topic very briefly. We cannot leave the room without the crisis in the Ukraine. And we are not going to deal with the crisis of the Ukraine, but really raise some implications that are relevant to this panel. Sanctions, cost inflation, human toll migration, and each one of you can pick one of those to reflection, a quick reflection on one of those. So I'll start from Carney because you have been involved in the study absorption of the Soviet Jewry, and we do not have really the time to elaborate, but give us the bottom lines. Thank you.
Okay. So Israel absorbed 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union over a period of 4 or 5 years, which increased the population in 20%. And what characterized this immigration wave was a very high education level, a lot of doctors, a lot of engineers, and so on. And I think the profile is somewhat similar to the profile of Ukrainians that are living now the Ukraine and some people who are living Russia. I think that there are 2 or 3 main elements that we can take from our, I would say, relatively successful story of immigration. And that was, one, immigrants were given a subsistence allowance that allowed them to sort of start their life and also take some time to study Hebrew, English, and some adjustment to their human capital in a way that they could be actually starting to work in their previous profession. But only 1/3 of the immigrants, of the doctors and engineers, actually started working as engineers. And I think in some way the program was somewhat too stingy. The more you actually allow them to, immigrants, to sort of adapt their education and skills to the local standards, the more likely it is that they will actually be able to use their human capital in the new place. There was also a huge program of housing with a lot of incentives in order to produce the necessary housing solutions. I think these are the 2 main points, and I'll stop here.
Thank you. Well said. This is a university, human capital, human capital, human capital. And indeed, it's a big challenge, but I think that we can give a very good example. Mark.
Okay. I'll pick up on your sanctions point, which is what we're seeing is, and absolutely necessarily, but it is a big shift, where slightly overstated, but effectively the weaponization of everything. And so the weaponization of the main elements of global integration. So obviously trade sanctions, that's been around for a long period of time, but moving very much at the heart. One of the first components of the Russian sanctions, just like some of the vis-a-vis China, with respect to technology and the technology stack. So you have trade, technology, and then critically financial sanctions, really crossing the Rubicon in terms of the measures taken against the Banque of Russia. And the consequence of all this is that, I mean, if there ever were global corporations, there are no global corporations anymore. You're going to have to choose a home. And to use, and a previous, someone who sat on this stage and good friend of ours and friend of Israel, Janet Yellen, a couple of weeks ago used the term friendshoring. In effect, the companies, maybe not with existing supply chains and value chains, but certainly the new decisions is where are the like-minded countries that I can put my people, my data, my technology, my capital. And that is a big, big shift in the world, and it's one that's going to increase resilience, actually, a common theme, because you're less likely to have these challenges with like-minded countries, but at the cost of some efficiency in the near term and cost that it will flow through the system. So I think a big shift with sanctions.
Thank you. Jean-Claude.
Share entirely the views which were expressed by both colleagues. human capital key, sanctions. Had I been asked to give an advice on whether or not to freeze the central bank reserve assets, I would have said, don't do that. Don't do that. Do a lot of things, but don't do that. You are preparing the ultimate segmentation of the world. It is very grave. And I have to say, back to the war in Ukraine, we are more than ever in a totally Knightian uncertainty. Anything can happen. And the fact that some are quietly mentioning the start of World War III, or that some are mentioning the utilization of weapons of mass destruction, tranquille, with a difference, of course, between tactical and strategic and so forth. I am absolutely frightened, personally. I think we are living in a world which is the most worrying I ever experienced myself.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. Before I make the closing remark, I would like to invite to the stage Dr. Eric Gertler, as of last night, another trustee, important trustee of the Zuckerman Institute, member of the board of directors of the FRENKEL-ZUCKERMAN Institute, a person that former Governor Cuomo in New York empowered to see how to revive, rejuvenate, and prepare the state of New York, and therefore the United States, and therefore by implication everything else beyond, to deal with the next crisis. So we are really fortunate to ask you to close this event before. Please, Eric.
Does this work? Hello? Great. Well, first of all, what a wonderful panel. It's just another reason why it's such a privilege to be associated with Tel Aviv University. And Jacob, once again, you've shown us that you're not just the master conductor of the orchestra, but we all know you know how to play all the instruments. As Jacob said, I had the privilege of overseeing the New York State economy during the COVID-19 crisis. Jacob asked me to tell one brief anecdote just to give you a sense of how quickly in a crisis you need to act. One day, Governor Cuomo, yet another type of governor, I might add, had called and asked myself and two others to come up very quickly. We had 2 hours on what essential businesses would remain open when he was going to close the economy the next morning. And myself, the budget director, and one other, we went through the list, we completed the list, and of course, the next day, that list was published. And what would you think? Of course, every business that was on that list that was considered an essential business thought that we were brilliant. And everybody that was not on that list thought we had no clue what we were doing. But it just gives you a sense in a crisis of how quickly you need to act, which of course these giants of economics have taught us today. What a great panel. We are so privileged to have had you as public servants on a global platform to help us through some of the most intense crises we've had over the last 10 and 20 years. So the only thing that I can say, what comes to mind, is the Mexican leader, Pancho Villa, was on his deathbed, and they turned to him and they said, "What do you want to say?" And he didn't know, and he said, "You know what? Tell them I said something interesting." So that's all I can say following you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I want to, my main kind of almost instinctive reaction is, if I were you, and I was sitting there, listening to these three former governors, I would sleep much better. Because I'll tell you, the truth of the matter is, knowing that the system has generated such professional leaders in each one in his own field and competence is precisely what we want. Because one of the issues today, when we speak about we have problem of leadership, we do not trust the leader, etc., is this paralyzes. We do not need to understand how the computer works as long as I know that the one who invented the computer knew what he was doing. The world is very complex. We will not be able to understand each feature. But when at the steering wheel there are people of this type, that's all that you need. There was one slip of a tongue of Carney that reveals a lot. He said, when Ben said and when Mervyn said. For some of you, you ask, who is Ben and who is Mervyn? So you know that Ben is Bernanke, Mervyn is Mervyn King. But the point is that we think about those individuals all in first name because we feel close to them. We understand how they think, and we understand how the mind works. And that's why even though the world has a lot of fragmentation in it, as long as we know how the other guys think, that's a long way. And let me conclude with a light tone and a quick story, because I did not tell you any story today. One. The idea is that, so there were two friends, Sam and Joe. And Sam went into a car and they drove with a friend. When they hit the red light, Sam pressed on the gas and they crossed. And the friend said, wow, what are you doing? He said, well, my other friend is always crossing it. They went on to the next red light, and when they arrived there, he pressed on the gas and crossed. What are you doing? My other friend. Then they came to the green light, and he stopped. He said, why did you stop? Because my other friend may come on the other side. The point is that not everyone needs to follow the same rules, as long as we all know, each one knows what are the rules that the other guy operates. So the world of fragmentation is a bad world, but as long as we understand what's happening, it's a little bit less good. So this is the note of optimism. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to thank our panel. We need to stay here for a minute for a photo.